might get a few more people pulling in here, but I have 12:01 on my clock. So hello and welcome to another episode of South Dakota Forest Health Workshop. Today's workshop, What's Eating My Tree? Common Defoliators in South Dakota. Dr. John Ball, who works as the Forest Health Specialist with South Dakota, will discuss the identification and management strategies related to the different insects that you might find in your backyard during the summer months. In an effort to conserve bandwidth, your microphones and video capabilities have been turned off, and we request that they stay this way during the presentation. As an equal opportunity provider, the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources encourages participation. Any questions can be placed in the chat box, and we plan to have a few minutes at the end of the presentation to answer some questions live. This workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be placed on our department's YouTube channel upon review by our technical support team. Society of American Forester credits are available during the live workshop. Please type those credentials into the chat box. Additionally, International Society of Arboriculture Certified Arborist continued education credits are available, and a CEU code will be presented at the end of Dr. Ball's PowerPoint for self-reporting. With that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right, well, thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to do this, and I'm pleased to have you here today. What I'm going to be covering is the most common hardwood defoliators that we see. And of course, pictures like you're seeing here right now, not me, but those trees, are fairly common. We get the calls in the summer, what's been eating my tree? And in some cases, they've already eaten and are gone, so we have to identify them by the damage that they did. And in some cases, we still have some of them still wandering about. So this is a fairly timely subject. And I'm going to discuss them by what they feed on in terms of foliage. And so we have the leaf chewers. Now, these are insects that devour the entire leaf. They'll consume all the leaf tissue, quite often just leave the petiole. So you have this little toothpick almost sticking out. Oftentimes they'll leave the veins last. They will devour everything, but the veins are the last. Think of them as the crust on your bread. Nobody seems to want to eat those. So if you catch them while they're still feeding, and this is a box elder that was being consumed by cankerworms, you'll often find the veins still there. But sometimes later on in the season that you'll find that, wait a minute, the complete leaf is gone. And that's where we get the calls. Where did all the leaves go? So we're going to start out with the leaf chewers, those insects that tend to devour the entire leaf. Though again, sometimes some of the veins will be left intact. These insects will often follow the veins, though, to begin with. You'll notice here on this dogwood how the insect kind of chomped along, and you can pretty much see where they chomped. But they kind of follow the edge of that vein as they were going at the beginning. Now, this particular insect, the dogwood sawfly, will devour the entire leaf eventually, and there they are. These are very common on red osier dogwoods and our other dogwoods. I don't see them much on pagoda dogwood, but all the other ones I can find them on. And as they get large, they get very colorful. Almost with when they start out, they almost have almost like a powdered sugar donut texture to them. And then they get very large like this, and they like to feed in groups. Sawflies tend to do that. And they'll curl like this. Despite the fact they look like they're rusting right now, they can devour leaves rather quickly. And here's a typical defoliation I find on dogwoods. You'll go out there, there'll be a few leaves near the bottom. There'll be leaves at the tips still, but everything in between will be completely gone. Now, the dogwood sawfly, the larvae tend to be feeding in late summer, so that's when you want to be looking for them. In fact, I'm just starting to see a few now in the Brookings area. They're going to move into cells in rotted woods and timber. For example, if you have a dogwood bed and it's bordered by landscape timbers or that, if they're not treated, you can find the cells actually in that. So they're going to overwinter as larvae in those cells, and then will form a pupae in the cell in the spring. And then you're going to find the adults May, June, laying eggs along the leaf vein. And then we start getting them hatching, like I say, usually right about now. And so there's only one generation a year that you're going to find on this defoliator to it. Now, we have another very common sawfly out there on our hardwoods, and that's the elm sawfly. And you'll notice this as the mature sawfly here, it's curling on the leaf. And you might notice, wait a minute, that's not an elm. Well, you're right. They will feed on elms. I can find them on American elms, but we also find them on willows. And here's a defoliated willow. Now, by the way, this is one where they noticed some a few days beforehand, called me, and I didn't get up there for 2 days. And they can devour a tree very quickly, as you can see. There they are. After they feed on the foliage, they drop to the ground to pupate. And on this particular tree, the ground was literally littered with the sawfly larvae at the base of the tree. And the adult that is out earlier in the year, this is about 1 inch long. I know there's no scale here, but the elm sawfly adult has got that kind of elliptical white spot on the thorax there. Is one of the largest sawflies. In fact, this one, we have it sent into us as pictures, but as is this that murder hornet that they hear about in the Pacific Northwest? No, I can understand their concerns. This does look like a hornet, something that's going to come after you. But no, it's a sawfly. And oh, by the way, they get the name sawfly because the female's ovipositor, what she uses to lay eggs, literally is a saw, and she cuts slits on the margins of the leaves to lay the eggs in, hence the name sawfly. And for the elm sawfly, larvae will be out soon too, so you might notice the defoliation beginning on elms and willows at about this time. They're going to drop to the ground by October, end of September, October, somewhere in there, even a little bit earlier. After Labor Day, I've sometimes seen them as early as. And then they're going to pupate in a cocoon. And then next summer, early summer, late spring, you'll find the adults out there laying eggs as well. And once again, the elm sawfly has a single generation per year. For some folks that are down near the Nebraska border or in Nebraska, you're going to see this move up a little bit. If you're up in North Dakota, you're going to see it move it back a little bit, but obviously it gets fairly cold up there soon. And so that October date is pretty much hard fast no matter where you are. They're pretty much done feeding it by that point. I should also mention some of the differences, that if you take a look at sawflies and our caterpillars, they do look very similar, but they are completely different insects. The sawflies are Hymenoptera. They are related to the wasps. And you'll notice that upper picture, it shows what we call 3 pairs of thoracic legs. Those are just above the head in this picture on the right side of that slightly curled insect in the top left-hand center of your screen. And then if you look behind those thoracic legs, you can count this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pairs of prolegs. Now, the prolegs are really stubs, but they do use them for grasping in that. However, these lack these what we call crochets that they can use to hold. And again, the adults look like wasps. Caterpillars have 5 or fewer pairs of prolegs. And these will have these little crochets, and I'm showing different patterns here. It's a picture from Colorado State University that they can use to grasp. And for these, the adults are butterflies and moths. Now, I might mention for caterpillars, and that'd be on your right side of your screen, there's a lot of different caterpillars out there. We do have tussock caterpillars, and you can see why they get the name tussocks because of those tufts of hairs. And then we have the loopers or inchworms, such as that cankerworm there, that have their prolegs way at the back, and then the thoracic legs way at the front, and they literally kind of inch away or loop away as they're moving. Now here's another one, and this is a caterpillar. So this is one of our butterflies or moths, member of the Lepidoptera. And if you'll notice, this is what we call the spiny elm caterpillar. You can see why it gets its name, those long spines. Now, by the way, if you're holding one of these, not that I recommend it, they're not venomous. It's not that they're going to stick you and poison you, but they're kind of like a poison ivy. They can cause a rash, depends on the person. But it's not one you want to have poking you. So these are insects that are often best left be. I might mention we also have Iomoths. Notice all those spines on it as well. This is feeding on chokecherry. And I'm just showing this one picture because we don't see these very often, but nevertheless, they're going to be out, and you don't want to be holding these either. And another insect that's out right now is the ash gray blister beetle. Now, these you can hold in the sense that it doesn't have any spines that are going to stab you and give you a rash. Instead, these can eject a blister creating material. And literally, if you hold them butt end, you're going to find you may get develop a rash, almost a bubbly, oily rash, something like a poison ivy, because of what these produce. They're very slow moving. You think you could pick them up. If you're slow moving, you're pretty well defended, so don't pick these up. And since these are just about finished feeding right now, I'm still getting pictures in, and I've seen a few in the field. I do want to mention the ash gray blister beetles. They go after legumes, and you'll find them near alfalfa fields. And this is a honey locust over in at the Wyoming border, and you can see every leaflet is stripped off these. I've seen them strip a honey locust tree in 3 days. And so this is one that I often get. People don't see them. They just see the damage that happens that quickly. Now back to the spiny elm caterpillar, and here you can see them. They like to feed together. Again, don't handle them because you can develop a rash. But when you get that many out there feeding on a tree, they can devour a lot of foliage very quickly. And we find these on aspen at the western end of our state, and at the eastern end of our state, they're very common on hackberry and willow. Now, again, spiny elm caterpillar, I can find them on American elm as well. I don't find them very often on the Siberian elm or any of the hybrid elms, but I'd say our most common is aspen out in the west and then hackberry on the east. And they do produce a butterfly. And so that is also known as the mourning cloak butterfly. So the mourning cloak butterfly and the spiny elm caterpillar are the same insect. We just have a different name for those two life stages. And the mourning cloak butterfly is an unusual butterfly. That picture I took in the fall, as you can see, there's one of the caterpillars on a Dogal crabapple. This is a moth that actually overwinters, and that's relatively rare. And so if you look at our spiny elm caterpillar, or also known as the mourning cloak butterfly, the adults can live up to 10 months. I mean, they will literally find an overwintering place and survive the entire winter, come out in the spring and lay eggs on the twigs. The larvae will feed. Now they're done now. And then they're going to be pupating here fairly quickly if they haven't already, but this is one you're going to see this fall. And it's actually a pretty good gauge of how much defoliation you can expect the following year. If you find a lot of them this fall, usually I find them on crab apples and such. That kind of gives you an indication you may end up seeing a lot of defoliation the following year, assuming we have a winter with adequate snow cover that kind of protects them as they're hiding in bark crevices and that near the base of trees as adults. I should also mention the difference between moths and butterflies, because I often get asked that. If you take a look at the left side of your screen here, those are moths, and that's one of the Sphinx moths. And these have comb-like antennae. You can see that in the picture there. And they also pupate in very silky cocoons. And they have usually kind of a dull colored wing patterns, and they're held flat at rest, as you can see here. Now, coloration, some of these actually are quite colorful, as Sphinx moths are. Butterflies, on the other hand, have these very long, thin antennae, as you can see here in the morning cloak. And they're going to pupate in a fairly hardened structure. It's made out of protein, so it's usually not the silky mass that you find. Many of them, not all, of course, but many of them can have very colorful wings. Think of monarchs, for example. And butterflies and moths tend to fold their wings when they're at rest, or kind of tent-like, as we'll see with some of the moths. A lot of our insects, they'll spend part of their larval stage in nests. So let's go over some of those. And we'll start out with, and this is appropriately named, the ugly nest caterpillar. Look at that. That is filled with little powder, all their poop, frass, and they'll just wad the entire leaf mass together. This is aptly named, and there is one of the ugly nest caterpillars. They have kind of a dark head, and the pronotum there has a little kind of spot on it as well. Otherwise, a light colored caterpillar. They're right now, as adult moths, they're about an inch wingspan. They're kind of nondescript, nothing you would really notice. But they're going to be laying eggs here fairly soon, and they're going to lay eggs on the bark, which will overwinter. The larvae are pretty much done. I do see a few. I see more of the nest still. And if you break the nests open now, you're going to find those little hardened cases in there, because that's where they pupate. The nests provide a lot of protection. But notice on this particular insect, they web all the leaves in the nest, so they can essentially eat at home. Kind of like we all did at COVID. They're just going to eat in that nest, hence the name ugly nest. It looks pretty bad by this time of year. And of course, we have the tent caterpillars. And we have 3 tent caterpillars here in the Northern Plains. This is the eastern tent caterpillar. And how you tell them apart, notice that kind of white line or light colored line going all the way along the back. The eastern tent caterpillar does make a fairly large tent. And the tents are usually somewhat in the interior of the tree, not right at the tips. We also have the western tent caterpillar, and this I find more West River, the western part of South Dakota. And notice here that line is more of a dash than a continuous line. And this also makes a webbed nest, as we see here. But then we have the forest tent caterpillar, and we see this at the northeastern part of our state. You can find it kind of in the southeastern part of North Dakota as well, and certainly into northern Minnesota. And this one has those keyholes, if you look at the back, or if you'd rather call that a sole of a shoe, that'll work as well. But notice they have that kind of keyhole pattern. Now, the forest tent caterpillar does not make a very tight nest, as you find with the other two. But other than that, the 3 are quite similar in how they feed. They feed in groups. So here we have our forest tent caterpillar, in this case in aspen. You'll find them in aspen quite a bit in northern Minnesota feeding. And here's defoliation. This was up in Roberts County, South Dakota. And that's basswood you're looking at, fairly common tree up there, basswood and ash, and they're completely defoliated. They'll go through, and they tend to be, particularly forest tent caterpillar, it comes at about every 8 years we get an outbreak. And when you get an outbreak, it defoliates everything. And then you have the larvae crawling around. When I worked up in Duluth, these were actually a nuisance in parks, but a temporary nuisance. About every 8 years or so, you had an outbreak, and then they kind of faded away. Coming up, we're going to be able to find them fairly easily, because you're going to be able to go out and find the egg masses. Now, that egg mass will hang on to a twig for a long time. What you want to look for later this fall is egg masses that look like molten glass. There will be no holes in them, and they're going to have kind of a varnish-like coating to them. Now, those are going to be egg masses that are going to hatch next spring. And I'll give you a hint. One place to look for egg masses, if you're in an urban area, is any place that has outdoor lighting at night. When I worked up in Minnesota, gas stations and hospitals, which tend to be well lit at night, tend to have these. And our standard joke was turn your yard lights out, but have all your neighbors turn your yard lights on. And unfortunately, I could find these near our yard light because Mom is a night flyer, and she'll navigate towards them. In the spring, of course, the eggs will hatch very early, just as the leaves are coming out, and you can see that very small nest forming. And you can find the very small larvae that are just beginning to kind of look outside and start to explore. Now, they can become about 2 inches long. Too often we do what I call revenge spraying. We try to kill them when they're big and done feeding rather than small. One of the best ways to kill them when they're tiny is just take some sort of stick, twist it into the nest like cotton candy, and rip it apart. Because once you've done that, everything that eats these can get to them. Now, I recommend that. I don't recommend a flamethrower. I get people that try to burn the nests off. Once the insects are gone, burning the nest is just entertaining. It's not going to do any control. And burning the nest while they're alive, that's not even entertaining, because you're probably going to set the tree on fire as well, and you're going to do more damage than the insects did. But they will start moving out of those nests. It's amazing how quickly they develop. And it'll start scurrying around looking for more to eat on it. The larvae feed in and outside the nest. They're just about finished up. And then they're going to pupate rather than in the nest like the ugly nest caterpillar. They're going to pupate on trees and buildings. And then you're going to see the adults out here fairly quickly. But again, they're kind of a red-brown moth, nothing noticeable. But notice in September and October, you're going to find those eggs. And the eggs overwinter. The easiest way to manage them on your apples and that, which they tend to like, is prune them out and dispose of the egg masses sometime this winter or spring. And once the egg masses are gone, you don't have the problem. The nests we're seeing developing now, in other words, the nests that are building now, are the fall webworms. And these tend to make them towards the tips, as you can see. The leaves have already formed in that, and they'll actually nest the entire branches. They tend to be found on cherries, cottonwoods, and walnuts. We have walnuts that are just covered with what appears to be cotton candy at their tips. And once again, this webbing, this nest, does provide protection and shelter from the larvae. And if you can rip those nests open when the insects are very small, that can help everything that eats them reach them. Now, the problem with trying to rip the nests open for the fall webworm is you've got leaves in there, and you'll probably tear up the leaves too. With the tent caterpillars, since the leaves are very small as those nests form, you can easily tear those nests apart. This is more difficult. The adult moth is right there. That's Mom that lays the eggs on these trees. The adults, again, are white moths. I often get them confused with gypsy moth, what used to be gypsy moth, now referred to the spongy moth. But the larvae are going to feed in and outside of that nest now. You know, they're my August. What made the web in my tree call? And then they're going to pupate in the soil litter. So once they finish feeding, they're going to crawl about the tree, devouring the leaves. They're going to drop to the ground, form a cocoon, and then in the spring become adults and then lay eggs. And then, of course, the larvae begin to feed. These often aren't as much of a problem as tent caterpillars because they're feeding on leaves, particularly walnuts. In September, you're feeding on leaves that have pretty much fulfilled their function. It would be nice to have the leaves for another month, but these tend to be more of an annoyance than a real threat to the health of the tree. We also have skeletonizers. Now notice here, they're leaving all the veins. You got to cut all the crust off their bread. It's not just the major veins that are left. It's every vein, and it makes this wonderful lacy appearance. And one of our best examples of that is Japanese beetles. Now, in the northern part of our area, we don't have those yet, but you get at about Highway 14 all the way across the state of South Dakota. So the mid part of our state, all the way across, south of that line, these are very common. In fact, we're having quite an outbreak of them right now in Brookings, for example. And if you look at grapes, they have just laced every one of them. The Japanese beetle adults are out right now. They're the ones that are feeding on the leaves. Their larvae are grubs, and they feed on the roots of turf grasses and other plants. But what I want you to notice is not only is they're shiny, but you see those little tufts of white? That's how you'll identify them, those little tufts of white on the side and on the underside. Now, the adults are these metallic beetles that are out feeding now, and they feed in large groups. They do produce a pheromone that brings others in, so that's why you rarely find a Japanese beetle. You find many Japanese beetles. When they finish feeding, they're going to lay the eggs in the soil. The eggs will hatch. The larvae are larger C-shaped grubs, as we call them, that are going to feed on roots. They'll feed on roots this fall, resume feeding on roots in the spring, then form pupae, and then become adults. For trees, we look at these as defoliators. If you're managing turf, you have a whole nother opinion of these because they're devouring the root systems of your turf grass. Literally, you can pull the grass back like a mat. They can become such a problem. One plant they really like are lindens. They like lindens, roses, and hydrangeas. If we look at woody plants, lindens, hydrangeas, and roses. But there are some differences into what lindens they like. American linden basswood, they will feed on, but it's not their preference. But we do plant a lot of little leaf linden and Mongolian linden as Harvest Gold, for example. They love those. And you'll find them, not the leaves gone, but all the leaves having this lace-like appearance. The other one we saw this year, and we only see it about every 6 to 8 years, it seems. Yeah, the June beetles, also known as June bugs or May bugs. And these also skeletonize. And here it is on a hackberry. Now they make big, they'll chew through the minor veins, unlike the Japanese beetles. Notice how this is kind of devoured, but they'll leave a lot of the veins still. And these are night feeders. Japanese beetles are feeding during the day, so it's very obvious what's devouring your hydrangeas, your roses. But for these, they're feeding at night. So these are the ones where people will call and say, I don't know what's been eating the leaves off my trees. I don't see anything. Well, you'd have to go out there about 2 in the morning. And by the way, you can also find a lot of adults right around gas stations, again, because of the night lighting. And there's the adult. Got one of these out during the day. There were a bunch of them piled up next to a gas station. But like I say, otherwise, the adults aren't going to be as easy to see. Now, what's interesting is these are bubbling out of the soil, literally beneath these ash trees. It looked like Swiss cheese. There were so many holes. And as I say, for this insect, it seems like every 6 to 8 years we have an outbreak. And we had that in our central part of our state this year, South Dakota. And then they fade away for a number of years. Now, these are going to feed on roots as well. Not a major issue on trees. And quite honestly, the defoliation is not that bad. But it's one of these questions we get, what ate the leaves off my trees, particularly Ash they like, and they like hackberry, two very common trees in our state. And you'll go out and say, my gosh, the leaves were fine a week ago. They're half chewed and I've never seen any insects. Well, it's a good clue you're looking at a June bug, particularly if you find the holes on the ground around them. Cankerworms. Well, South Dakota and North Dakota both have cankerworm problems. And again, these are also known as loopers or inchworms because of their locomotion. There is a fall cankerworm, as you're seeing here, and there's also a spring cankerworm, as you're seeing here. The difference is not when they feed at the same time and cause the same side of damage. It's when the adults are out. But at the end of the day, they're both defoliators that tend to be skeletonizers when they're small. And then as they get larger, may end up devouring the entire leaf, as you can see here, with just maybe the midrib vein being left. And they will feed on oaks, as you can see here in this picture. The fall cankerworm, the adults are out in the fall. Now, the interesting thing with the cankerworms is mom can't fly. She literally has to crawl up the tree. Some of you might notice in some towns, I saw this in Minnesota, I see this in North Dakota more than I see in South Dakota, these bands of sticky material like tanglefoot wrapped around the trunks of the tree. The idea behind those is as mom's crawling up the tree to lay eggs, she gets caught in them and is killed. Eggs are laid on the twigs and they will overwinter. In the spring, the larvae hatch just as the leaves are coming out, where they're young, tender, tastier. And the larvae are so small in the beginning, they have this little thread and they can float to surrounding trees. So they can go to a nearby tree that maybe eggs weren't even laid on. And then they're going to pupate in a cocoon in the soil. So for the most part, their feeding is pretty much done. And the spring cankerworm, really the difference here, you'll notice again, mom walks, she does not fly, is when mom's out. And she'll lay the eggs in bark cracks. And again, you'll see the same thing. People put sticky material up to kind of stop them. And then a particular form of skeletonizing is what we call window painting. And that's where you have the insect actually only feeding on one side of the leaf between the veins. Do you notice in this picture? You'll see all the veins still there, even the finest veins. But you can see through the leaf. And what happened is mom or dad, these are the larvae here, fed on the upper part of the leaf. And so the light gets through it. And our most common that does this is what we call pear sawfly or pear slug. It's not a slug. It's not a snail, but I can see why it gets that name. This one has about 2 generations per year. You'll find the larvae out in May and June. And then you'll usually find a second generation in September, and they'll overwinter on the ground, of course. But they can very quickly take a cherry tree. They love cherries. And on these sand cherries, they're going to go through there and devour that. Yes, you can find them on pear. I can find them on mountain ash. But it seems to be the cherries are what we see them on the most. And then we have leaf miners, insects so tiny they actually feed at least part of their larval stage in the leaf itself. And the one we see the most of right now is the European elm flea weevil. Now, this, as the name implies, is not from North America. In fact, it's not even from Europe. It's actually from Asia, but they goofed up the identification, and by that point, the name stuck. And this insect arrived in North America in the early 2000s. We found it in South Dakota, actually Hot Springs, interesting enough, the first time in the mid 2000s. And now it's throughout the state. And it's really displaced the elm leaf beetle, a beetle that feeds on the leaves. Where now we have this weevil, which is a type of beetle, by the way, that does most of the damage to our elms. And that's why it's a weevil. It's got that big snout on it. And that's what the larvae do. They actually feed in the leaf. Now, this is a picture of an American elm. But this favorite host for this is actually Siberian elm, which is its native food source in Asia. And that, so I can occasionally find an American elm. I did here, but not as much as I can find it on the Siberian. But during the larval stage, it's so tiny, it actually can feed inside the leaf. And that's a picture I took earlier this year of the larvae feeding in there. So again, this is a beetle that's doing it, but it's a type of beetle we refer to as a weevil. And then here's some more of the damage. Now, what you're looking at here is the adult feeding. So in this case, the adults and the larvae both feed on the foliage. There's the adult out there feeding. And so what we have here is we have the adults overwintering. Now, the adults will be feeding a little bit later on this fall, and they're going to overwinter in the litter. And then in the spring, when the leaves just come out, they'll start feeding on the leaves just as they're forming, and they'll make holes in the leaves. Eggs are laid on the leaves, and then when the eggs hatch, the larvae feed inside the leaves, and that's where we get all that mining. And it'll be a rather large blotch mine, we call it. And then they'll pupate in cocoons in the mines, drop out, hence we'll have more holes in the leaves, and the adults continue feeding. I've seen some elms that look like Swiss cheese between the feeding of the adults and the larvae. Now, again, its favorite food source is any Siberian elm. And I've noticed with our hybrid elms, if they have a lot of Siberian elm in their heritage, you'll find them hammered. For example, Triumph elm. I've got them on campus. By early fall, all their leaves are just covered with holes. Vanguard is one too that has a lot of problems, but I won't see it on the accolade elms. But Japanese beetle tends to like the accolade elm, so there's no way of getting out of this. You're going to find something feeding on it. But if you're looking to plant elms, and I love elms, take a look, at any elm that has a lot of Siberian elm in its background is going to be a very suitable host for the European flea weevil there. Well, what's the concern about defoliation really? Is it the health of the tree or the appearance of the tree? Because in some cases, only the appearance may be affected. Now, the appearance is important. There's been a number of studies that have shown that, in this example, cottonwood leaf beetle, 5% defoliation. At 5% defoliation, people notice it. They don't like it. At 10%, they figure you should have sprayed if you're hired to do it, or someone should be spraying. 10% defoliation does not affect the trees at all. In fact, interesting enough, with some of this defoliation, it's got to be about 50% before it really affects the health of the plant. So when I'm out talking with people, it's always, are we worried about the health of the tree or the appearance of the tree? Now, I understand it if the appearance is important. And unfortunately, too, quite often we're talking to them because the defoliation's already happened, which means you're a little late for control. But I always tell them, well, you know what? Don't worry. This is not going to hurt the plant. It wasn't defoliated enough to harm the tree. Now, next year, you may want to treat it to keep the defoliation from really appearing, from detracting from the appearance. But as long as you tell them, well, you know what? It's, maybe a 20% defoliation. That's very noticeable, but hardly going to harm most trees. Well, what do we use for treatments? There's a variety of chemicals out there that we can use. They can either be soil or trunk injected, or we can have foliage sprays. If you're using soil or trunk injections, those need to be in the soil or in the tree before you find the defoliators. So these are ones that you anticipate, okay, this year we saw this defoliation. It was caused by this insect. We're going to treat next year at the appropriate time, usually about a month or so, or at least a couple of weeks before the larvae will begin feeding, if it's a larval stage.